All right. So we are actually on the questions for Lesson 4. We're going to move into Lesson 5 here in just a minute. There is one part of this that I want to scoot this down just a little bit. One particular part that I wanted to address that we didn't, it's not discussed in the actual lesson, and I wanted to kind of address it before we moved on to the questions. Our lesson writer makes a statement here on this first page at the very bottom. If we wanted to use one phrase to describe why people abuse the use of drugs, it would probably have to be because of its mind-altering effect. And that can be true, and certainly that's the end result of most of these drugs that are being brought up. But certainly there are probably far more popular or more widespread motives as to why people may initially begin to abuse substances. What are some of those? Sorry? Pain. Okay, yeah, pain. Certainly that can be a real problem, especially in today's society. We're given certain medications for pain, and either accidentally or sometimes even on purpose, people will abuse those. And that certainly can be because they're in a great deal of pain, and maybe it's not enough, and so they kind of self-medicate a little bit more than what the doctor gives them permission to do. What are some other motivations?
Physical reality.
Sorry?
Break from reality.
Okay, break from reality, stress related. Okay, maybe there's something going on in their life that's causing them sorrow or like I said, stress or some sort of issue, and so they just kind of want to escape. Going? Okay, Nolan stole your thunder.
I meant to say to feel high. Get to feel
So the mind-altering effects, the actual the desire to kind of do something different rather than the monotony of everyday life. Boredom, okay. Boredom certainly can probably be associated with that. Well, yeah, I was thinking, pressure from others in the sense of the desire that maybe the pressure that individuals may feel from others in order to fit in order to feel like they're not the fuddy-duddy, the oddball out sort of thing. Sometimes that can be a problem. Also, there's the actual pressure that maybe others can place on us, individuals that may make fun of us for our beliefs or make fun of us for not joining in or whatnot. Certainly that can be a part of it as well. Obviously, there are lots of motivations that can be associated with the beginning of such abuse of substances. And certainly it's not just mind-altering, but certainly as our lesson writer brings out, that ends up being what the end result is that all of these substances in some way affect our perception of reality. And that ends up being the ultimate draw most of the time, is regardless of the initial purpose or reasoning or justification, whatever it is, it ends up being, and again, as is talked about in our lesson, there's either a psychological dependence, a physiological dependence. There ends up being that desire to continue. And of course, as with all drugs, you need more and more and more in order to achieve the same result. And that's the danger of that, certainly. I just wanted to mention that before we moved into our questions, because that certainly it deserves to be noted that there are multiple motivations involved there. Anything through that? All right, let's go on to our questions. So we're on page 23 of our book. Starting with our question number 1, the word, this word that he's wanting to talk about, is from a Greek word signifying the use of medicine, drugs, or spells. Sorcery. Yeah, as we talked about in the lesson, our English word pharmacy or pharmacology actually comes from the Greek term that is used in the New Testament oftentimes for sorcery. And that speaks to why did some people think individuals were magic, and it was through the use oftentimes of drugs or substances in order to achieve a mind-altering effect. And that kind of caused people to think individuals had some kind of magic power. But that's certainly part of the the origins of that term. The Greek word that he's wanting to talk about means to be free from the influence of intoxicants. Nepho, yeah, nepho. And I think that's important to note in so much as the idea of being sober or sober-minded certainly speaks to the need to be able to have proper judgment. And that's in association with, in fact, nepho is sometimes translated being of a sound mind. So being free of intoxicants is certainly connected to the need to have a sound mind, to be able to make proper judgment. And if our body is not free, especially our mind is not free of something that can cause us to have our judgment impaired, then that's an issue.
You know, Michael, kind of tied into your question earlier, sometimes people will take these things thinking it will help them to have better judgment or to perform better, maybe not understanding the effects of the whatever drug or alcohol or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and I know we're not going through all that, but
Yeah.
sometimes a little bit of knowledge
Would go a long way. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not to say that, and certainly I think it needs to be made clear that sometimes it's not on purpose that people become addicted or people have issues with substance abuse. Sometimes it's entirely like we talked about. Sometimes it's accidentally taking too much medication or whatever, and sometimes that can happen without having some kind of sinful motive or sinful purpose behind it. But we have to be very careful, even with the things prescribed to us, even things that are for what we might call medicinal purposes, that we're very careful with those. Yeah, number 3, the most prevalent drug used today, at least as of the writing of this article, is alcohol. Yeah, alcohol. Certainly he mentioned the fact that alcohol is considered a food in today's society and by most governments. However, it is a drug in that it affects the mind, certainly affects the body, but it affects the mind. Number 4, it takes a teenager how long to become addicted to alcohol? 15 months. And by addicted, I think the point of that is physiologically addicted, which is to say that there would be withdrawal symptoms if someone were to stop. Becoming an alcoholic is what's being referred to. I mean, obviously there's psychological dependence and things like that could happen far quicker than that. But that's in contrast to adults, which it can take up to 15 years for an adult to become physically addicted to something like that. And so that's just showing the difference of how susceptible teenagers and young people are, particularly to certain substances. Anything through number 4? Number 5, the second most popular and widely used drug is, of course, again, at the writing of this article, it was marijuana. Whether or not that's still true, I don't know, but it certainly would probably be pretty, LSD I don't think is nearly as popular as cocaine and marijuana today. Number 6, marijuana acts on what part of our body? Nervous system, yeah. Number 7, hallucinogens make it difficult to distinguish between what? Fact and fantasy. Yeah, fact and fantasy. It's where kind of dreams seem real, or what might seem like dreams all of a sudden become real. People start seeing things. It can be actually, my understanding, it can be very scary actually. Number 8, many volatile substances produce an intoxicated state when inhaled. Yeah, volatile substances are defined as things like paint thinner, things like that. Those are volatile substances, certainly flammable substances, but those are things that are inhaled. Number 9, chemical drugs which produce mood elevation and a heightened sense of well-being are known as stimulants. Yeah. In fact, barbiturate is thrown in there kind of as a trick because it's one of the depressants. But yeah, stimulants is one of those that is designed or is used as a mood elevation, heightened sense of well-being. Any thoughts through those? All right, moving on to numbers 1 through 6. Some of these we're not going to get too far into, like some of the slang names for illegal drugs being used today. I think it's good for us to keep up with that just so we know, but certainly those things change from year to year. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on number 1. That's just going back through some of the names that have been used. Some of those aren't as relevant today, maybe as they once were. Question 2, or list 2, list passages that you might use to show the sinfulness of drug abuse.
1 Thessalonians 5,
First-
1 Peter, a couple of
Yeah, Galatians 6, or Galatians 5, and Galatians 6, actually both of them. What a man sows, also that he will reap. Of course, talking about also as well as the works of the flesh. There's several different passages brought up in our lesson as well. 1 Thessalonians 5 is one of them that certainly come to mind as well. There's a whole bunch that we can look at, including the passages dealing with being of a sound mind, having proper judgment, that sort of thing. In fact, Ephesians 5 is one that I thought of as well. Ephesians 5, do not be drunk with wine, but be filled with what? The Holy Spirit. And of course, within that text, we are to knowing the will of God. Okay, that's what we're supposed to know. That's what we're supposed to be full of, is the Holy Spirit in the revelation of the Word of God. And certainly the importance there is not to be intoxicated with the world, but to be intoxicated, so to speak, or to be full of that which is of God. Number 3, list some of the diseases that come from extended use of alcohol. Liver disease is a big one. Ulcers. Yeah. And certainly, even since the writing of this lesson, there's a whole lot more impacts, especially doing with the brain, neurological diseases that have been linked to alcoholism and alcohol that certainly have impacts as well. Number 4, list some of the effects of hallucinogens.
There's so many where to start.
That's why this one, yeah.
It's dangerous to yourself. Step off into the traffic, you can hurt someone.
disoriented.
Yeah, you're disoriented. Somebody kid can be hurt. You could
Yeah.
drive your car into a wall. That's just
You know, you hear,
there that's not there.
yeah. Well, and you hear reports, and this is the problem of the blending of fantasy with reality, in that you don't know what's real and what's not. You know, there are reports of people doing great deal of damage to themselves and to others because somebody appears, to have spiders all over them, or some other, being or creature or something, and they think they have to do something about it, and they get convinced because what they're seeing they think is real. And it can be really, really dangerous when you start down that path and you lose that reality versus fantasy ability to discern what is real and what's not. I mean, that's just, that's terrifying.
It can be paranoia.
Oh, yeah.
Family have wages in, they think you're out to get.
Yeah, that's true. And hallucinogens far beyond just the effects of the impact of the drug at the moment. There's long-term effects as well. Yeah, paranoia, and certainly there's there's been links of memory issues as well. Being able to properly remember things, that's actually an effect of several of these drugs as well, is not being able to remember. Number 5, list some of the effects of the use of volatile substances, such as sniffing, airplane glue, nail polish remover, etc. There's a whole host associated with this one earlier in this, right here on page 21. Disorientation, hallucinations, delusions, stupor. That's why this one has several lines on it, because there's a whole bunch associated.
The airway can damage organs.
Yeah.
As he brings out with some of these, and you were talking earlier, some of them may have an initial, here, a dreamlike state. I want to do that to just feel better or to forget some problems or whatever. But it's the advancement that he'll talk about here, as well as the next lesson. This leads to this, to this, to this,
Yeah.
to this.
Yeah, things escalate, especially when you start down that path. You want to feel the whatever the effect is more intensely, and so then that escalates to a different drug and so forth. Number 6, list some of the effects of heroin.
It can be used for pain relief,
Yeah,
but again, it can escalate to stupor,
There's certainly, and we talk about long-term effects, and there's memory issues as well connected with heroin. Some of the biggest ones certainly have to do with the dependence issue of it, and the physical effects that can have on the body as well as on the mind. But certainly the desire there is for that sense of complete lack of care, lack of thought for any worries or concerns. It's kind of like cocaine and others that kind of give you this sense of a lack of care in the world. And for people who are trying to escape something, people who are going through hard times, depression especially, things like that, that's something that they seek out. And it can, unfortunately, it's a false. Obviously, are the problems still there? With any of these drugs, those who are trying to escape problems, is it actually helping anything? No. And so ultimately it ends up giving a false sense of I don't have to worry about it. And unfortunately that takes away some of the opportunity for us to maybe actually deal with our problems rather than running from them. All right. Number one for agree, disagree. Drug abuse is not really a problem for Christians. It shouldn't be, right? You would hope it wouldn't be, but that's not true. Right.
But there's a term called polypharmacy that doctors use. There's a lot of people that use a lot of medications for a lot of different reasons, and not all doctors are diligent to make sure that they're not interacting poorly within a body. So that's one thing that you can be mindful of as Christians: of do I need all of this? Is there something I should not need to take? But make sure you get a good doctor.
Well, and pretty much every medication you take is going to have some kind of side effect, or at least potential side effects. And certainly you got to take those into account as well. Yeah. All right. So we'll kind of go quickly through these. Question 2, since marijuana has not been shown to be physically harmful, then there is nothing wrong with using it. Do you agree or disagree? Yeah.
It depends on the study.
It does, doesn't it? It depends on the study. Now, there is a component, and we'll talk more about this in our next lesson as well. There is a component of marijuana that can be very useful. What component is that? There's the CBD oil, okay, that can help with, or at least supposedly can help with arthritis and things like that. And there's certainly some pain relieving elements, not to not smoking marijuana or something like that, but to medicinal elements of it that are debated back and forth. Whether or not those things are any more effective than other pain relievers that we actually have access to and are currently legal and things like that, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, just because something may or may not be physically harmful, that doesn't take away the impact that it causes, even if it's short term. Okay, can a drug that simply causes short-term intoxication or short-term impairment to my judgment, can that be enough to put me in a state where I may commit a sin I wouldn't ordinarily commit?
It's the same argument for alcohol.
Yeah, as long as you don't get drunk, right? Or if I just drink a little bit. And the same point is, and we talked before when we talked about drinking in a lesson, that at 0.02 alcohol level, that's 1 can of beer, 1 glass of wine, 1 shot of liquor, your blood alcohol level is going to be 0.02. And at that point, that's where it's defined as lowering of inhibitions. That's a problem. If we're, as Christians, if we're wanting, we need our inhibitions. Okay, we need to be inhibited, that self-control to inhibit us from doing something we ought not. And unfortunately, that's what happens when you get involved in that kind of stuff. It lowers those inhibitions. Snoop?
Two things. My good friend Lloyd Fairchild used to say, if you take a drink, you're one drink drunk.
Yeah.
And then the second is anything that alters the chemistry in our brain makes us less able to defend the truth. And we're supposed to be always ready to defend the truth.
I would maybe say unduly counters the chemistry in our brain. Certainly there are individuals who need certain medications.
Well, I'm on a medication
Yeah.
that does that, but I'm talking about in this situation.
Yeah.
Marijuana.
Yeah.
cocaine, that kind of- I mean, even when we go in for general anesthetic or we're taking a drug because we had knee replacement, that doesn't, but that's for medicinal purposes.
Right.
not-
But even then, we have to be careful. Yeah.
Absolutely, not for ongoing pleasure.
Right.
you know.
Right. And to me, that kind of is the focus there. Am I using something for pain? Am I using something to beyond what it's prescribed for? And certainly that has a big impact as well. That goes into the motivation of, am I trying to escape something? Am I trying to, what am I trying to do here? Lisa, I see your hand.
I didn't, but I will say that because it affects our neurological system, that it is physically harmful. It could be to ourselves, but also to those around us. And
Yeah.
if it slows down my
Our reactions,
time
yeah.
and I need to stop fast and I'm under the influence, I
Yeah.
could harm not only myself, I can harm other people.
Yeah. It's surprising. It's surprising the amount of medications on our prescription bottles that come with that label, be cautious when using heavy machinery or driving. And then some of those medications, the pharmacist will tell you, do not drive for 8 hours after you take this. Because, and certainly, I mean, we've seen the news reports of people who have no intention of doing anything bad and maybe taking the medication for the right reason, but then they get in a car and drive and they hurt somebody, not because they meant to, but then they're liable for manslaughter because they were intoxicated. Okay, DUI or driving under the influence, driving, certainly being impaired in some way. That's a problem. Yeah.
Well, one thing you have to consider is when you get into the marijuana debate or any of these kind of drugs, is typically people are trying to appeal to some emotional side of the argument. Well, my son has cancer, he needs it for pain, or, they get into these emotional arguments. But really, we got to think about what Jesus said. We have to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind.
Mhm.
That's the number one law. That's what we're trying to do. So we need to focus on that when we're talking to people, not trying. You don't want to get into this emotional argument
Yeah.
of these different things.
Well, and there's so many hypotheticals that go into it as well. And as we talked about last week, the people who argue red wine is good for your heart, so that's why I take red wine. Yeah, but studies have shown that certain, grape juice is even better than red wine. So why are you justifying taking red wine when you could just take a glass of grape juice? It's that type of mentality that sometimes people can use certain excuses as a crutch because they really want to do this regardless. And so this is just a reason that they're putting out there, trying to legitimize this reason for a different purpose or for a different motive. And that's obviously being honest with ourselves. That's kind of a important component to that, is if we're being honest with ourselves, what is our motivation for this? What is our purpose in doing this? Number 3, there is no danger of becoming addicted to drugs if they're prescribed by a doctor. No. Number 4, as Christians, we should try to warn others of the dangers of drug abuse. Sure. Yeah, sure. Now, is drug abuse the only problem that our society is dealing with right now? No, not at all. I think it's part of a greater purpose, though. As Caleb mentioned, of loving the Lord our God, with all of our soul and all of our mind and heart. It's all about focusing on what God wants us to do. And drug abuse or using substances for an ulterior purpose, that's part of a larger component of under the umbrella of what would God have me do? Would Jesus be sitting on the side of the street smoking marijuana? No, his purpose was to fulfill the will of the Father. Okay, so he would not be involved in that sort of thing. And of course, far be it for me to speak for the Lord, but that's not the example we see in the New Testament. Anything through number 4?
I think it's a good thing to bring up the gospel. It's a good way to
Sure.
segue into talking to people about things that aren't good for you.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
These debates at work and different social things people talk about, drugs. And I was just talking to some guys that came down from Norman the other day that worked with us. It was like, hey, talk about drugs. Like, well, I don't do drugs. Well,
Yeah.
why don't you do drugs? Well, then you have an opportunity to talk about the gospel.
And certainly fentanyl is a big deal right now. That's kind of the big one that people are talking about right now. It's not the only one, obviously. It's not the only problem, but that's a big one. And there certainly is a component to it, certainly as a society trying to stop the flow of drugs being freely through our country and that sort of thing. I can appreciate that. I want to be careful how I phrase this, though. A lot of the anger is towards the drug dealers, and it should be. I'm not saying that they're innocent. But we also have to be mindful of the individuals being persuaded to take these things, okay, to actually consume them for whatever reason. And this goes back to teaching our children, helping our children to understand the need to not care what anybody else thinks. If they're going to make fun of you, let them make fun of you. It's not a big deal. What matters is what God thinks. And trying to help our children to understand, our teenagers especially, to understand that we don't take part in those types of activities. We don't take part in those types of substances for the very reason that we see all these terrible situations where individuals, teenagers, take these substances and end up either accidentally or on purpose hurting somebody or themselves. And then a lot of the anger, and I'm not saying they're not victims, they are, but at the same time, choices that they made also contributed to that. And ultimately, that's what we have control over. We don't have control necessarily over what's coming into our country, what's not, what's available on the street, what's available at my school or my kid's school. What we do have control over is whether or not I'm going to allow those things, make the choices that are going to end up putting those things in my body. And ultimately, I believe that it would, a two-prong attack on that. Sure, law enforcement, whatever, on the freely available drugs, certainly, but at the same time, some effort to teach our children that you don't need these things. You don't need these things to feel self-value. You don't need these things to have other people think that you have value. There are certainly in the scriptures, we have coping mechanisms given to us even during difficult and sorrowful times. All right, anything else in number 4? Snoop.
We tell our kids they don't need them, but I can think of a young man who killed himself or overdosed or something, and he was from a family of Christians. So when I hear, tell your kids don't do, well, of course, but also show them the alternative. If you're getting pleasure from this, what else is going to give you pleasure? Let's address the underlying issue, because if you don't have a problem, you're not trying to escape something. So why is it that, yes, you like that, but what else, if you're, let's just say you're out for dopamine, if it's a dopamine rush, then what else is going to give you that natural dopamine rush or that natural adrenaline rush?
Sure.
And we have to be able to, and I mean, it's going to take a sacrifice on parents if you've got a kid. I know personally of a man, he was an upstanding, he was a deacon in the church, and he had some health issues, and he ended up getting addicted to prescription drugs. And it took a huge toll on his family.
Oh, yeah.
He had 3 kids, and it was one of the saddest things. He didn't want to be, but somehow he ended up being.
Yeah.
And so, when we see somebody that's struggling with that, there's only so much you can do if the person doesn't want help, but praying for them, trying to be around them, and knowing that it can happen to anyone.
Yeah.
Whatever your addiction tendency is, we all have something we struggle with, and so I think we just have to be careful when we're talking about drugs, especially with young people, is what will make you feel the same way? What will give you that feeling? And what is it that's bothering you so bad? And a parent may not be able to do that.
Yeah.
Someone else in the church, a confidant in the church may be able to do it. What has you so down that you need to feel better using something that's harmful to your body?
Yeah.
And we can say don't, but maybe you're due.
Yeah, well, and explaining the motivations behind why some people do, and explaining where in the scriptures we can find outlets to be able to understand how we can address any feelings we have. I read an article just the other day about a study that was done showing that for at least in some cases, exercise is just as good as antidepressants for extremely depressed individuals. They did a study and it showed that people who exercised for at least, I think it was 15, 20 minutes every day, that they were able to go off their antidepressant medication if they continued to exercise at least 5 days a week for 20 minutes a day. That it released those chemicals in the brain to be able to make up what these medications were providing. And if that's the case for people who are legitimately having depression issues, what about some of our kids who just sit in the house all day and play video games and don't get out and do anything? Get the vitamin D from the sun and so forth. All right. Anything else to question 4?
Mike,
Yeah.
one thing we kind of skipped over the listing of the different names for drugs.
Yeah.
But it's an important thing to talk to, especially your kids about. When I was in high school, we used to go to the middle schools and talk to all the kids about drugs and alcohol and problems, because that's where it starts, is in like 6th, 7th, 8th grade. That's where a lot of these addictions start for kids. But you got to explain what drugs are. Don't do drugs. You tell your kids all the time, don't do drugs.
Yeah.
They don't know that's what this pill is.
Yeah. That's right.
So
Well,
it's very important, not necessarily to know all the slang terms and everything, but explaining exactly what drugs are.
Well, and certainly in our society now, we've got these reports of some of these fentanyl pills looking like Skittles and things like that are tricking kids thinking they're candy, which is just insidious. But that's how they're trying to get people hooked on them. And once they get them hooked, well, then they don't know any better, and now they're coming back for more. And so, that's one example, certainly of especially for our young kids, making sure they know, listen, you don't take any candy from anybody that isn't in a package, or maybe even not then. Being real careful with what we take from people, or what people are offering us to eat or anything like that, because there's marijuana brownies and things that can be baked into stuff, and there's TV shows that have kind of cast a light on it that people can accidentally eat those things and get high and don't even know it and that sort of thing, and it can be really, really insidious, some of the ways in which people can try to get others hooked on it, and that's awful, because it's not that person choosing to do so. They're not seeking it, and yet and we have to just be very careful. All right, anything else through number 4? Yes, no.
Maybe I'm only speaking for myself. I think sometimes we underestimate the powers of evil that are at work in this world. Several scriptures come to mind in the Prince of Darkness and those kind of scriptures. For me, I grew up in Wichita Falls. It's my hometown. I like to think of this nice, safe, great place to raise kids and all that, but those things are at work here. I believe for last year, the number for fentanyl deaths was 18 for children under 21 in our city. It's not a Dallas or Washington or whatever big city problem, and that's just one example. And so as we're talking about like how we need to talk to our kids, as Caleb's talked about, or a different one, 30 seconds once in their life probably isn't going to combat all those forces that are at work throughout our community.
Yeah.
Going after our children.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And sometimes as parents, we think we tell our kids once something and they've got it. Well, we would like that to be the case, but the point is that kids most often forget whatever you say within a couple minutes. That repetition, warning our kids to be aware of themselves. This is why Paul says to walk circumspect in Ephesians chapter 5. Walk circumspect, redeeming the time. Be aware of yourself. Be aware of your surroundings. And that certainly speaks to the example we're setting for others, but it also speaks to any dangers that may enter into my scope. Okay, that may temptations that may come my way and whatnot. Now, certainly we can't be prepared for every temptation in the sense of seeing it coming. Sometimes, like in the case of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, it's there, it's happening. Now what? But we can, at the very least, do our due diligence to think ahead. And what am I going to do in that situation? Joseph ran, and we have to be prepared and teach our children on a continual basis, to be not just be aware of temptation to sin in something obvious, but also especially maybe even the aspects of pressure that our kids feel being around kids of the world, and how difficult that can be sometimes for them when they want to be liked, they want to have friends, and when those friends are pressuring them, or at least they feel pressure to fit in with them, the effects that can have on our kids. Make sure our kids know that, you know, it's easier said than done, certainly, but make sure our kids know that they have somebody they can talk to. You know, we can talk about these things, and the fact that God, I mean, the only person we need in our circle is God. But certainly those things are important to kids. We have to be able to deal with them. Nolan?
You mentioned a little bit ago, like the way movies or portrayals on TV or whatever. So many of these things, it's the marketing of it, the presentation of it. As back in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve been told something and say, no, it's going to make you feel better, and this,
Oh, yeah.
that, and the other.
Yeah.
And similar thing with a lot of drugs and stuff we're talking about here. Somebody's going to tell you, if you're ignorant, this will help you, make you feel better, you'll forget your problems, you'll get this floaty, ecstatic feeling.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's a commercial, particularly on when I listen to the Gamecock football games, I listen to the radio while I'm watching it on TV. And there's a particular ad that plays all the time in every commercial break about beer. And it's about an ale house in Columbia, South Carolina. But one of their taglines is, beer makes people happy. Beer makes people happy. And every single time I hear it, I just roll my eyes, because the way they're presenting it. Of course, then they have that please drink responsibly. At the very end, very 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 quick, kind of the small writing there at the end. But does beer make people happy? Really? Does it make people happy? Does it just give you the feeling that you think you're happy? Yeah. Beer's a depressant. Certainly, and it can have the exact opposite effect, and yet how they're portraying it is this will make you happy, and people want to feel happy, so go drink some beer. All right, anything else to question for? Yes, sir.
The key word is abuse.
Yeah.
Abusing something. Take aside the illegal drugs and think about alcohol or prescription drugs. You can abuse that just as easily.
Well, and
Or anything.
yeah.
A hammer is used to build things, but you can use it as a murder weapon.
Yeah.
Anything.
Yeah. And certainly to a certain extent, the idea of the abuse of our ability to properly judge, the ability to properly judge, and there's a whole lot of things that can affect our sense of judgment, and we have to be very careful about that. All right, anything else through that? All right, very quickly, let's move on to Lesson 5. We're just going to pick up a couple things here before our second bell rings. This is more specific, talking about marijuana. And there's some statistics on here now. This is coming from 1978. Some of the details, obviously, that's going to have changed quite a bit. But there's a couple things on here that I did highlight that I thought were important to kind of bring up. Since when has God ever determined righteousness and morality upon the basis of human actions and rationalizations? I thought that was a pretty good point. The answer is never. Moreover, the scriptures specifically state that it is not in a man who walks to direct his steps. Of course, Jeremiah 10:23. It certainly, that's in every aspect. We're at least supposed to rely on God to direct our steps. Unfortunately, that's not how man conducts himself all the time. God has provided the only guide to life and godliness. 2 Peter 1, verse 3, we've been given all things that pertain to life and godliness, and that is our standard by which we are supposed to live. In the instrument of the Bible, all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for doctrine, or for teaching, doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be adequate or complete, equipped for every good work. 2 Timothy chapter 3. It is the Creator and not the creature that determines right and wrong, just and unjust, moral and immoral, and heaven or hell as a final abode of the spirit of man. And in a lot of ways, how some of the drugs, and in this case it's marijuana, is being portrayed as a life choice. It's anything else in a lot of ways that we're kind of talking about, especially that's applicable in our society right now. Homosexuality, transgenderism, it's a life choice. And who are you to say what's right or wrong? And certainly as it pertains to our lives, the lives that we're supposed to be living for God, God is our creator, and we are supposed to adopt the values that he has instituted in his word, his standard of right and wrong, for ourselves. Now, we can't force that on anyone else. We can teach them. Okay? We can try to talk to them. We can't force that on anybody else. But that doesn't change what's going to happen at the judgment. What does John chapter 12 say? What does Jesus say about what's going to judge people at the judgment? My word will judge you. Okay? And of course, that standard of right and wrong, it's not going to matter how you justify a certain drug, and this, as I said, this particular lesson is talking about marijuana specifically, or how we justify a lifestyle or anything else. In the end, it's ultimately going to be Jesus' words that are going to determine right, or that has already determined right and wrong, and that's the standard by which we're going to be judged. And we don't get to just change that. Now, there's a lot of people who don't care or don't believe that. They will one day. The relationship of the righteous and Christ has to be one of respect for the name of Christ, an attitude of not wanting to do anything that would bring shame to the great and glorious name of the Son of God, the King of Kings. He brings up Colossians 3, verses 2 through 4. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on the earth. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. And I certainly think that setting our mind on things above, if our mind is supposed to be on things above, and of course you include Philippians chapter 4, starting in verse 8, whatsoever things are true, noble, pure, meditate on these things. And then I allow my mind to be compromised in some way, where no longer is my mind on things above. Now it's on the earth. No longer am I meditating on things that are pure, noble, and righteous. Now I'm meditating on, being high or whatever the effect I'm going for is. Then that's obviously an issue. That's a problem. Anything through that? The Christian and Christ are to be inseparable, and the Christian should not set his mind upon anything that Jesus would have no part of. I think that's a good point. Trying to, there's that adage, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus not do is probably just as applicable as what would Jesus do. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up here in this particular paragraph next week, and Lord willing, we'll get through the rest of the lesson and our questions next week as well. Thank you, everybody.